because I don't think America makes it easy for people who immigrate to belong at all. I think they make it incredibly hard, and that burden ends up falling on the backs of immigrants themselves in ways that aren't fair.
And after writing this novel, I'm talking to the people about it. Did the meaning of belongingness for you morph into something more complicated than it has already been or have been?
That's a really good question. I think belonging for me is this really ephemeral idea. I feel like always in my life, belonging is this thing that I'm chasing, and I can feel it when I'm in it, and then it goes away. And so what's been powerful for me in this process is finding belonging in spaces and places where I didn't necessarily expect it. And feeling those moments of belonging and feeling them in this really intense way. I don't know that it's a way that stays where I'm like, and now I belong all the time, everywhere. I think that is a challenge of being a woman of color and a queer woman of color in this country, is that kind of belonging. I don't know that it exists for us. I wish it did, but I'm not sure it does. But um, like I get these messages from like baby queers in rural Pennsylvania who are like, I read your book and you're my favorite author now. And I'm like, what is happening? Right? Like, that's beautiful and amazing and not something I ever expected as part of this process. And like, there's belonging in that. There's being seen in that. And there's sort of like knowing that person is reaching out because they also felt seen. That kind of belonging, those moments have been really, really beautiful. And there have been tons of them. There have been these moments where I get like I'm in a conversation with someone who's very different from me, who's a white, straight, cis het man, who's like, I didn't think I'd have anything in common with your book. And yet, like, I read it and I was like, oh, you're like me in all these different ways, right? And there's belonging in that moment, which I wouldn't have anticipated and he didn't anticipate, but like somehow there's like a moment of belonging between us. So I think that sort of like finding those connections with people, I feel like for me is a kind of belonging. And there have been so many of those in this process. I think when it comes to like the experience of immigrants in America and like what belonging means and what sacrifices people make to belong and the ways in which sometimes they have to make themselves small or put parts of themselves away, I think those questions around belonging are going to still be with us for a really long time, because I don't think America makes it easy for people who immigrate to belong at all. I think they make it incredibly hard, and that burden ends up falling on the backs of immigrants themselves in ways that aren't fair. And so I think that big question of like capital B belonging, I don't think I've found it. And I don't know. I don't think any of us have.
When we navigate through life, people of marginalized majority are constantly finding themselves dealing with the outside world of whiteness within a space of duality. Wanting to be seen, most will code switch to seem more personable and acceptable to their white counterparts, to a point where some will double down for a survival state. What ends up happening is that we are still othered and discriminated and at times physically harmed. What was it for you when you sat down to write these set of essays, and deal with this battle of wanting to truly feel comfortable and exist in a space that sometimes seems to bounce back and forth between acceptance and outright bigotry?
I think this is like one of the biggest learnings I had during the writing of this book is like how my parents' understanding of this country is so different from mine, and how I think that they experience discrimination as like an individual act against them, and how being born here and learning the history of this country, like I have a systemic understanding of those issues. And so I think for my parents, they thought like if you just keep your head down, if you just don't make any noise, if you don't make waves, if you try to be nice, if you try to get along with people, they thought that they would keep them safe. And safety was a real concern. We were living in Southern West Virginia. There were not a lot of brown or black people around. So safety was the number one priority. And I think they thought it would keep them safe. And I think for them, they didn't realize until after 9/11 that it wasn't enough. That was the first moment for them when I think they saw the sort of like systems of racism and how they come down on people. Because I think for a lot of South Asians, that was the first time when like institutional power really turned against South Asian people in this country in the way that it has turned against Black people for centuries and turned against Asian Americans in many ways for a long time. But I think they felt it most intensely in that moment. I think for me, growing up in schools where I was seeing that all the time, like I kind of knew, like, it doesn't matter what I do. You don't care. I can try everything. And it literally does not matter what choices I make. If you're coming with what you're coming with, you're going to give it to me.
Right.
And so I think that meant that I sort of ended up choosing to live my life in a really different way than my parents did over time, where I sort of was able to say, like, it doesn't actually matter what I do. So I'm going to be free. I'm going to live in the ways that make the most sense to me, because whether I do or don't, you're going to say what you're going to say either way. So I'm not going to make myself small for you. It took me a long time to get there, but I think that's ultimately what I ended up deciding with this book was like, I could stay shut on these things. They're going to happen to me whether I stay quiet about them or whether I get loud about them. So what does it look like to at least like take up some space?
So your essay, The Blue-Red Divide, it was, I'll be honest, it's like, I think one of probably the hardest, maybe one of the hardest essays that I've read in your collection. But anyway, you presented the readers, this is why it's hard for me, the eternal confusion of how do you continue to love and respect somebody that you thought accepted you, but when they were left with their innermost beliefs, they might be still completely against you. We have family members and friends that we share the most intimate moments with, and yet whenever we talk about things such as politics, we feel like they transform into this unrecognizable being that I feel ashamed to be associated with. So I always was asking myself when I was reading your essay, how do we cope? How can we keep ourselves hopeful that maybe someday, we can possibly see eye to eye again?
The fact that that was the hardest essay for you to read is probably also because it was one of the hardest essays for me to write. You picked the two hardest to start with, which is not unusual. I feel like they're the two people go to most quickly. I think because they're the stickiest. Like they're describing a lot of complexity and a lot of hard things to navigate in relationships. I mean, I think this maybe sounds cheesy, but to me, part of me feels like writing that essay is really important. I think a lot of us are alone. Like it's like you on your screen looking at what someone else is doing on their screen, and it just stays there, right? And you grapple with that kind of in silence or internally instead of being able to be like, how do I do this? Like, how are you handling this? How are you handling this? Part of what I wanted to do in that essay is say, I don't know if this is the right way, but like, this is how I'm handling this right now. This is how I'm trying to make meaning of it. This is how I'm trying to find empathy and trying to hold this person and say, I'm not going to cut you off. I'm going to take space. We need space, but like we can have space and not say like, never again will we ever see eye to eye. I do think like a big part of it is like the polarization is on purpose. I think that politicians are really invested in keeping us polarized and in making us focus on the things that are different about us instead of talking about the things that are similar. And so the only way through polarization, I think, is narrative. I think it's storytelling. I think it's using stories to connect with people. Like, how do you stop being at the polls? You got to get closer together. And how do you get closer together? You get closer together through story. That's how we build with each other. That's how relationships happen. That's how we connect with each other. So I do think like it's not like an easy solve, but I do think the more we talk about it, the more we can sort of like surface and say like, here are the hard things and like, here's what we're doing about them. I think the other thing that I tried really hard to do in that essay is to really dig to think about why. Like, why have we ended up in such different places? Right. What is it about my experiences relative to his experiences that is causing us to be so far apart from each other? And that why question and the really digging in and digging in and digging in and around it is, again, not something that I think is being encouraged by media right now. We get these like real flat, oh, they're racist, oh, they're sexist, oh, they're this, oh, they're that. And it's like, yeah, all those things are true. Sure. And what's under them? Where's it coming from? Why is it happening? Because if we don't figure out why any of this is happening, we're never going to get through it. We can't. So I think the more we like keep asking ourselves that why question of like, why is it this way? And in the case of Mr. B, like the place where I grew up is in terrible shape now. It really is a struggling place in a way that it wasn't in the 80s. And he's lived there through that whole thing. So he's seen it not be a struggling place. And now he's seen it become a place where people are really struggling. And no politician, Democrat or Republican or anything in between, has offered any solutions that have meaning for folks in Appalachia and in the Rust Belt and a lot of parts of the rural South. People have been struggling for a really long time and they're not seeing answers. That's gonna make you angry.
Yeah.
And so I have empathy for that anger. Like I feel like, what does it look like to implicate like the systems and the leaders who are creating the situation, as opposed to sort of like laying all of that blame at the feet of individuals, is the thing I think we have to figure out how to do.